Unfortunately for us, the detailed conversion accounts, the wonderful sagas that are incredibly rich in detail, the poetry of Eddic and skaldic nature from Scandinavia, and the great corpus of mythology that has been preserved, we have none of that in Frisia. So that's a great shame. It's wonderful that it exists in Iceland. The approach to looking at pre-Christian religion in Frisia is somewhat different because of that. Because we don't have these kinds of sources, we're forced to use what we have. So Elrond has a bit of a point there. All right, first of all, I'd like to take a look at sacred places, as this is something which is touched on a lot in those hagiographies, those sources of the conversion of Frisia. So here we read in the Vita Liudgeri about the various shrines. Now, the word that's used for a shrine is the Latin fana for the plural, fanum for the singular. You may know the English word fane, which is a borrowing from that. The direct meaning of fanum is somewhat unclear. It's some kind of temple, some kind of shrine or holy place. The texts also mention that within these temples one might find idols or some kind of statues, is how that's normally interpreted. This is very interesting because if we take a look at the Lex Frisianum, so the law of the Frisians, we can read what happens to someone who breaks into a shrine. And it says, "Whoever shall have broken into a shrine and have taken something from what is sacred there, he should be led to the sea, and in the sand which the tide of the sea is going to cover his ears will be cut, and he shall be castrated and sacrificed to the gods whose temples he has violated." So, not too pleasant. What's very interesting is that the martyrdom of Boniface, which occurred in Frisia in 754, that occurs after Boniface is described as having cut down Thunor's oak. So the sacred oak, we can think of a grave, that was near to the border of Frisia. So Hans Moll has actually argued that the killing of Boniface isn't a random act by brigands, as it's portrayed in several of the saints' lives. Instead, this is Frisians actually carrying out the word of the law in the Lex Frisianum, because Boniface has destroyed a sacred place, one of these fanum, and therefore he is being killed. Another of the saints' lives, the Vita Willibrordi, about the Anglo-Saxon Willibrord, who is often called the apostle of the Frisians, mentions a place called Fossitusland. Now, in this text, as well as the Vita Liudgeri, both of which talk about it, we can read what actually happens at one of these sacred places. It says, "None of the natives would venture to meddle with any of the cattle that fed there, nor with anything else, nor dare they draw water from the spring that bubbled up there, except in complete silence." This is quite interesting because it's actually a description of one of these places that is referred to as one of the Fana. However, I'm quite skeptical about this source for a few different reasons. If we read further, we get very much the idea that this is a narrative tale. This is a holy man who is by a storm washed up on a beach. The locals are all a bit weird, and there's a spring there with strange rules. Of course, he will break because he's the rebel. He's being shown as kind of the badass of the story. It's a little bit like the kind of the folk horror tradition. Is very much within that narrative framework. Obviously, it's much later, but the Wicker Man or the Apostle, it's that kind of thing. There may also be, as Tom mentioned, the classical topoi are very important to look for in this case, because it's quite similar to descriptions of the cattle of Helios, which is mentioned in the Odyssey, where there are sacred cows and silence has to be observed, etc. We should remember that the authors of these sources were learned men. They were oftentimes in scriptoria, where they had access to classical texts, and they were writing for an audience that was also very much part of a learned elite, a learned world. So in a way, this wasn't a kind of anthropological exercise to try and show, okay, this is what they believe, this is how the sacred place works. It's rather a narrative, a story that fits into a broader narrative of saints' lives and hagiographies that they no doubt had access to within these scriptoria. It might be a little bit like that we're less likely to refer to, let's say, folklore and folk tales from our own tradition than we might be to a TikTok reel from the United States. And sorry to the Americans, but for me, it's, you know, coming from the United States, because that is the culture of the day. That is what is seen as the, that is what is seen as the culture of the day, rather than necessarily accurately portraying our own lives. Perhaps it's a similar thing, or it's a poor metaphor. Either way, so this Forsitusland is described as being on the border of the Frisian land and the king of the Danes. And so a good candidate for Forsitusland is this island in the middle of the sea here. Today it belongs to Germany, and that is Heligoland. Now this would be very interesting because that name would potentially have an etymology of holy land, which would indicate that perhaps there is a shrine there. However, there are several other ideas behind the etymology. So in the native Frisian that is spoken there, Hollander Frisian, it's called Deat Loon, which just means the land. But that ethnonym of Hollander actually probably comes from the word Hollig, which I know we have one Frisian who may know at the back there, but that means high land. So potentially Heligoland comes from high land rather than from holy land. It's also true that Heligoland is really quite small. It's actually smaller than it used to be because the British tried to blow it up in the Second World War, unsuccessfully, thankfully, for the people of Heligoland. But there have been quite in-depth investigation archaeologically to look for any trace of a kind of temple or structure, and they found nothing. So perhaps that means we should err on the side of caution with this tale. What is interesting, however, is that name of Forsite, because that name of Forsite is very similar to the name of a Norse god called Forseti, who we find. And it's related to, many people here have been in Iceland, the president of Iceland is called, if I'm not mistaken, the Forseti. And it's related also to the Frisian word Voorzitter and the Dutch Voorzitter, which also has a meaning of president, which is rather interesting. We find this name of Forseti in Skaldskaparmál, for example. This is Caroline Larrington, her translation of it there, where he is mentioned in a list of various deities and that he rules at a hall called Glitnir, which is rather interesting. And it seems to be the case, based on the etymology of Forsite, that Forsite was the original name and that the Norse likely took the name and then it became Forseti, going over into that tradition. We find another sort of these shrines on another island, this time the island of Walcheren, today at the very other end of Frisia, in the modern province of Zeeland in the Netherlands. And in this story we have Saint Willibrord, who comes onto the island, he destroys a pagan idol, and then a healing well bubbles up out of the ground, and it's said to have healing powers until this day. Now this is rather interesting because we know that wells have a certain significance in pre-Christian Germanic beliefs. There are several sacred wells, in fact, like the Well of Urth, for example. These wells are often hidden beneath the ground, they come up and then they give divine knowledge, such as when Odin casts his eye into the well and then gains knowledge from it. So, as was being said in another of these talks, when Connor mentioned Pope Gregory, who had sent out and said, don't destroy the pagan sites, but perhaps make them Christian. I would argue that perhaps the site that Willibrord has destroyed isn't a site at all, but might actually be the well. What if the well is the shrine in this case? And that he has simply destroyed it by converting the well itself into a Christian shrine with relation to Christianity. Wells are an important motif when it comes to conversion narratives because it contrasts pagans who actually worshipped wells and the powers that came out of it with the figure of Christ, who is shown to be the only wellspring of knowledge that there is. So perhaps that is what is going on here, and that we shouldn't be looking for temples at all, but rather more natural features that might have held spiritual significance and been the home of various spirits. We also get several references to sacrifice in these stories. Here we can read from the Vita Wolframi that the most wicked practice devised by the deceit of the devil resided in the aforesaid leader of the heathens, in that he would very often sacrifice as part of the rites of their gods, the appalling rites, not of gods but of demons, the bodies of those condemned to death, condemning some to the attentions of men with swords, hanging others on public gallows, most cruelly squeezing the life out of others with garrots, while some, with devilish instinct, he would also drown in the tides of the sea or the creeks. So this really comes up as just looking for many ways in which you can kill people in a horrible way. The kind of propaganda behind it, or the subjective view that we see here is very evident, I think, coming through the text. But what is interesting is that we have another reference to drowning at the end. So drowning in the tides of the sea or in the creeks. This obviously mirrors what we see in the Lex Frisionem, where drowning is also the punishment of someone who has broken into a shrine and taken something from it. Now, as I said at the start, Frisia is an incredibly waterlogged area. Today in the Low Countries, they have built dikes, and so that stops the water from coming in. This was before there were any dikes, so it was completely open to the sea and the power of the flood. These floods would not only kill people if they didn't make it onto the Terpen on time, but could flood away whole herds of cattle and fields. It was incredibly destructive. However, at the same time, the sea was literally what enabled the Frisians to go out and become the traders that they would become famous for. They traded all over the North Sea and the Baltic and even further afield. So the power of the sea and whatever spirits resided there must have been incredibly important to the Frisians. And so I would argue that possibly in this regard, the giving of bodies to the sea, the sacrifice by drowning, would enter someone into a liminal state between water and land and possibly appease any deity that was ruling over the sea at that point. We had earlier mentioned, I think it was you, Tom, who mentioned the deposits of armies into bogs and such like. It's possible that this could be a connection with that as well. Although, as ever, if you're dumping things in the sea, we're probably not going to find it back. So it's hard to find archaeological evidence for that. A final example that I'd like to look at from the hagiographies is this one, which is based on ancestor worship. Now, this has often been talked about. It's an episode in which the king Redbot, who refuses to become Christian, is seriously considering conversion. He is standing by the baptismal font, and then he has one question and changes his mind and remains a pagan till his dying days. So this episode is much celebrated both by neo-pagans who see this as a strong pagan figure who rejects Christianity outright and sticks with his previous religion, as well as by Frisian nationalists, because this is a kind of Frisian exceptionalism. Frisians are seen as being incredibly, that when they set their mind to something, they're not going to break, they're not going to stop at all, they'll remain themselves and not be influenced. But there are other ways to look at it. So, as we read, he drew his foot back from the font, saying that he was not able to do without the company of his ancestors, who had been princes of the Frisians, and to dwell with a small number of poor individuals in that heavenly kingdom. On the contrary, it was not easy to give assent to these new teachings, and he was instead going to continue with those that he had observed along with the whole Frisian people for a long time. This is a very interesting passage, and there are a few ways that we can look at it. John Hines, for example, takes the view that this is actually the king making a value judgment on behalf of his people. It may be seen in a similar way to King Oswy, the brother of King Oswald, who was decapitated and possibly partially dismembered by a raven. He decided in 664 at the Synod of Whitby to go with the new Roman tradition rather than sticking with the Irish tradition of the church that he had grown up with. It's possible that Redbart, while for an early medieval king, Christianity had some great advantages, it's possible that he foresaw that converting might instead make him a lackey to the Merovingian king, or perhaps that it would inspire revolt or civil war among his people if others did not want to adopt the new religion, and that was why he decided not to. I take a somewhat different view, and I think we should actually see what is Redbart's reason, that is stated here at least, for not converting. And to me, it's not actually really a religious reason, but rather, if I dare say, as a Frisian, slightly more snobby reason, which is that he complains that his ancestors had been princes, whereas those in the Christian heaven, which is of course open to any whose souls have been saved, are a small number of poor individuals. So to me, that suggests that the afterlife that Redbart had envisioned was one in which he would be with fellow members of the aristocracy. And I think that's a rather interesting point there, and that at least if we can rely on the Vita Wolframi, which is another question, then that would be his reason that he did not wish to convert and then end up in the Christian heaven. So there's a big question about whether the Vita Wolframi is actually reliable or not. These hagiographies and missionary texts, they have a certain bias. They were written in a milieu that was aware of older saints' lives, of classical texts as well, and they knew that the audience, which was largely also churchmen, we believe, would also be aware of that. And they were writing with that in mind. So Ian Wood has written specifically about the Vita Wolframi, and he believes that really most of it is fabricated, and we shouldn't really believe anything that comes from that text. Others, like Stefan Lebeck, do believe it's actually a reliable text, that much of the information about the pre-Christian Frisian religion comes from a young boy, a Frisian boy, who was saved from sacrifice by Wolfram, though the jury is still out on that. It remains the case that these hagiographies, they always focus in on the negative, more barbaric aspects, because they were literally trying to stamp this belief out. So we should definitely bear that in mind when we look at it. We never come across pagans doing anything that is productive or helpful. They are either terror-stricken, as they are on Forsythusland, or they're busy garroting and stabbing and hanging and drowning people. It's not the most flattering picture, and we're sure that they were up to other things too. But, well, we don't have that written down, unfortunately. To move on quickly to one of the old Frisian texts that we have. This is from Van de Koningen Karle aan de Redbad. So this is a very interesting text, because the oldest fragments from this are found from around 1200, though the only complete text that we still have is from around 1660, though it definitely goes back to an older tradition. What's interesting about this is that this is a story. So we have Koningen, so the king Karle, which is Charles, so that's Charlemagne, and Redbad, so Redbad, the king that we've just been looking at in the Vita Wolframi. And this is a source that basically talks about how the Frisians were given law by Charlemagne, although of course this is long after the time of Charlemagne and Redbad. When those writing it, the Frisians were also Christianized. The story goes that Charlemagne selected 12 lawmen, Aseiran, as they're called in Frisian, and he set them adrift on a rudderless ship out into the sea. So we pick up from there. It says, when they had finished praying, then they saw a 13th man sitting at the tiller, and he had a golden axe upon his shoulder, with which he steered to land against the current and against the wind. When they came to land, then he thrust the axe into the land and threw up a sod. Then a well sprang up there. That is why it is called at the court of axes. That is Axenhoven in the old Frisian there. It's related to Hof in Dutch, for example. And they came to land at Eswe and sat around the well. And whatever the 13th man taught them, they accepted it as law. I'd like to focus in, there are many interesting things going on here, but one thing that is particularly interesting here is this word, which is Eswe. The reason why Eswe is interesting is because we believe that an older form of this word would have been Esawe. And Esawe can be translated as the road of the gods. And if we break that down further, the gods part of that is Esa, which is etymologically related to the Old Norse Aesir. And what's further interesting is if we can compare this with the Old English corpus, we see that in the Old English corpus we do actually get on its own an Esa, which is obviously from the more Proto-Germanic root of ans, which is God, os, I think it is in Old English, and then I believe this is an I-mutated form that we find. So in this case, in the genitive, I would believe if it's from Esawe. So this is very interesting because it may suggest that what we're looking at here is a pre-Christian myth that has survived in this story about the law code that has then been given a sort of Christian shell around it. So most of the time, the 13th Aseira that comes and brings the 12 others to land is seen to be Christ. We obviously have the disciples, the same number as 12. That could be interesting. But we could also suggest that 13, the reason why we have an odd number of Aseira, is because in a law decision, you will never have a split decision if there is an odd number of people. So there may be a practical reason why there are 13 there. The other big question that I would ask about this is, why would we have a reference to the road of the gods with a word that comes from Ans in this story unless it went back to something from the pagan past? if it was important that it was a divine road, they could have used any number of words there. Godsway, for example. God is a good Christian word that is used for God at this period and no one else. And yet we find Esaway, which is obviously, as I said, related to the Aesir, related to the Old English words for those same gods. Nelleke Eisenacher and several others have, based on this, suggested, and based on several of the other themes, a golden axe, a well springing up from out of the ground when a turf is removed, that this does have the feel of a kind of myth to it, and perhaps a pre-Christian myth that has been preserved. Could we be looking here at a literary version of Pope Gregory's message, that instead of destroying the pagan, you simply Christianize the pagan, and that this is a pagan story that has been Christianized and then encoded in Old Frisian lore? It's possible. It's an interesting idea, but further research is, as ever, required.